they all took off. It was, I mean, it brought tears to my eyes. It was absolutely beautiful.
Were you on the Vermont Bird Tours trip to Monhegan 2 days after on 9/11?
No.
Oh, okay, I was on that, and a lot of people dropped out because they were actually anxious about being on an island, far from family after that. But yes, the monarchs were just staggering. I mean, just so incredibly beautiful.
They're a beautiful butterfly to begin with, but that was a wonderful thing to see in nature.
Yesterday, Bernie, was yesterday? Yes, yesterday, Bernie and I saw the first, our first mourning cloak.
Oh.
And it looks so odd to see a butterfly with no leaves anywhere, just.
I did see a mourning cloak about a week ago at La Platte Marshes, a couple of them. And
what do they eat?
Go ahead.
What do they eat?
What do they eat? I don't know. Maybe they're insects. I don't know. There are insects out, but I don't know. True. I have no idea.
I don't either. I was worried about the guy.
Well, but it's typical. They overwinter, like the red admirals and what else? I think there's 3 or so that overwinter, and they are right behind bark. And I can't imagine that spending the winter all folded up like that, but they do.
We won't start exactly at 1:30. We'll give people a few more minutes to arrive.
Okay. I have nothing planned today except to go pick up our CSA share.
Okay, we can get started. Good afternoon. I'm Jane Vossler, and I want to welcome you on behalf of the Community Senior Center on such a gray, kind of windy day like this. It'll be nice to take a trip to Monhegan Island. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce Maeve Kim. Some of you may have heard her present about her kayaking and canoeing adventures in Vermont a few months ago. And now she's back to tell us about Monhegan Island. So I'll turn it over to you. And I also want to remind you to please not only mute, but today we're also going to turn off our video cameras because Maeve has heard that it makes for a better reception. Okay. To you, Maeve.
Thank you, Jane. So Monhegan Island is a really small place. It's 12 miles off the coast of central Maine. It's only 1.5 miles long. It's only about a half a mile wide. But packed into that are miles and miles of walking trails, several wonderful places to stay, good places to eat, lots of artists and craftspeople, a lobster fishery, and during spring and fall migration, lots and lots and lots of birds. I've visited the island twice now, once in 2001 and again in 2018, and both visits were magical. So I'm looking forward to taking you all on a virtual visit of Monhegan Island. When I'm traveling, I look for good places to stay on the way to good places to stay. So for Monhegan, I drove the 260-something miles from my home in Jericho Center to Tennant's Harbor, Maine, so I could spend the night here in the lovely old East Wind Inn, because then the next morning it would be only a short drive to the ferry, and I wanted to catch the first ferry of the morning. And after checking in here, I had time to wander around, then I have a great seafood dinner at this inn, and the next morning, a gorgeous sunrise, and then a fabulous breakfast, which that inn is famous for, and it's my favorite meal of the day. And I watched the Tennant Harbor lobster boats heading out to sea. And that is a scene that for anybody just says Maine. And then the ferry to Monhegan. The island is served by 3 boat companies, and I chose the Port Clyde to Monhegan boat line because that's the mail boat. So that they run even when the other 2 might not be running. There are no private cars allowed on Monhegan. So there's a big parking area right at the ferry dock, and that parking fee is included in the price of the ticket. And the ferry itself has lots of room, and because it's needed. Every single passenger is allowed up to 50 pounds of luggage, with an extra charge if you want to have even additional pieces. And most people, when I was getting on the boat, had additional pieces. Visitors who rent cabins or cottages on the island bring with them every single thing they're going to need for their stay. Hiking equipment, walking sticks, cameras, binoculars, tripods and spotting scopes, clothes for warm, clear days, clothes for cold and windy days, clothes for wet and foggy days, humongous coolers and bins with most or all of the food that they're going to need. There are little stores on the island, but the selection is limited and costs quite a bit more than the same food would cost on the mainland. Well, I lucked out on my ferry ride. It was a gorgeous day, choppy, but not bad at all. And the following 2 days were so blustery and cold and rainy with such high waves that several of the ferry trips were canceled. So people who had planned to get out to the island the day after I did couldn't get there. And the view as we neared Monhegan was classic Maine. Rock-bound coast, pine trees, houses with weathered cedar shingles. There are 7 inns or B&Bs on this little tiny island, as well as several rental cottages. And the Island Inn, the one at the top there, in fact, they're sort of arranged by size. The Island Inn looms over the harbor. It's that big building in the back. And it dates from the very early 1800s. It was enlarged about 100 years after that to accommodate increasing numbers of tourists. And then more major renovations were done during this century, including the addition of private bathrooms for some of the rooms, which previously had not been part of any of the big hotels. And after docking and waiting for the tons and tons of luggage to be offloaded, we walk up one of the winding dirt roads, past small homes and fish shacks. That little island in the distance, by the way, the island in Monhegan Harbor, is named Manana, and I am not sure if it's Manana or Manana Island. From 1930 to 75, the island was inhabited by a man from New York City. And the story goes he just got tired of New York City and tired of people, and he had money. So he put up that fairly large house there on Manana Island and became known as the Hermit of Manana Island. The house is now empty. The man is long gone, but there's several goats still left on the island. Many, many, many Atlantic islands have been used for centuries as fenceless animal enclosures, and they have names like Sheep Island or Hog Island. On the far side of Manana Island, there's an automated fog signal, and the tiny island is also famous for ancient rock inscriptions that have been variously identified as Norse, Phoenician, or Native American. I think the tendency now is to think that they're Native American. You can't walk any distance on Monhegan Island without seeing evidence of lobster fishing. There are piles and even heaps and even walls of lobster traps at the harbor and in front yards and all along all the roads and trails. Almost all of the 60 to 70 year-round residents are involved in tourism, art, or lobster fishing. And the local lobster industry is really unique in several ways. One, their lobstering is done mostly in the winter, when others have already hauled in all their gear. The market supply of lobsters is limited then, and prices are high. And Monhegan has its own designated fishing zone that no one else is supposed to go into except Monhegan fishermen. And local fishermen have voluntarily banned the harvest of small lobsters, leaving them to mature and reproduce. And they've actually voluntarily limited the number of boats and the number of traps to protect overfishing. Probably because it's such a small and close-knit group, Monhegan's lobstermen haven't experienced the kind of sometimes vicious rivalry that's been seen in some other Maine lobstering communities. One man told me very seriously he has never heard of cut or tangled lines or stolen catch ever on Monhegan, adding that they all know they can count on each other in times of trouble and they would not hurt each other's livelihood. I saw proof of this island's long history of lobstering, even quite far from the water. Actually, even in the middle of the woods. And fishing equipment is often repurposed for other uses, like buying fireplace wood in an old fishing net. I went to Monhegan partly because I love the ocean, but mostly for birding. And the island is a famous migrant trap. It's a tiny dot of green in a vast ocean, and weary and starving migrant birds land and feed. There are woods, there are lots of flower gardens, there are wild and cultivated berry bushes, there are hedgerows, all providing food and cover for the birds. And many residents also maintain vegetable gardens. In fact, Monhegan Associates, an island land trust, is a leader in affordable housing initiatives, land conservation, and sustainability. They're really big on sustainability. And the island farm is a great example. It provides healthy and very, very local food for the community and volunteers. On my first visit back in 2001, the whole middle part of this village, the village is only probably a third or fourth of the island, but the whole middle part of the village was the scene of a determined battle against invasive Japanese knotweed, which a resident had imported for his or her garden years earlier. And using herbicide was out of the question because the biggest patch of knotweed was right over the island's drinking wells. So residents improvised. Whenever someone had a carpet or a rug or a mattress that needed replacing, instead of sending it to a landfill off island, they just laid it down over the knotweed. Didn't look very scenic on this scenic and often visited island to have this big, big section of old and mildewing discards. But it did help keep the knotweed under control until the Monhegan Associates organized and carried out a consistent program of manually removing the plant one by one over and over again for several years in a row. And now the center of the village is full of private and public vegetable gardens, and I did not see any knotweed at all in 2018. And every forkful of food that's grown on the island is a forkful that didn't have to be imported from the mainland. Sustainability has a whole different meaning when you're many, many miles out to sea. That whole desire for sustaining their way of life led to the formation of the Monhegan Island Sustainable Community Association, or MISCA. There used to be over 300 main islands with year-round communities on them. Now there are 14. The increasing popularity of second homes has just sent property values skyrocketing, and Monhegan, like the other islands, has experienced a drastic shortage of affordable year-round housing. So MISCA now buys residential property whenever it comes up for sale and sells it to year-round residents at considerably below market value. And the land is put on a permanent trust, and the amount of appreciation is limited by covenant, so that when the house comes up for sale again, the selling price will still be affordable for Monhegan year-round residents. I think that's great. I was very impressed. I've been very impressed with this island several times. Little tiny Monhegan trucking, and I mean little tiny. I think they have 2 trucks because you're not allowed to have a whole lot of vehicles on the island, and they're used all for bringing luggage up from the dock and for emergencies. But Little Monhegan Trucking is experimenting with green alternatives to fossil fuel, partly for sustainability and partly because it's really a nuisance. I mean, every single drop of gasoline is brought to the island in 5-gallon containers. And year-round residents, they have got to be hardy souls. The winters are long and cold and windy. There can be weeks and weeks at a time when it's impossible to leave the island. And until very few years ago, electricity was extremely limited and unreliable. And most of the homes and inns were unwired, and many are still unwired. There's no resident physician, there's no pharmacy. The few roads are really just narrow and winding dirt tracks. So response in the case of an emergency wouldn't be fast anyway. There is a helipad on the island that can be used by life flight choppers, but of course that option depends on the weather. Fresh drinking water is limited. Any place that offers lodging has signs urging people to take very short showers and to avoid wasting any precious water. Groceries, clothes, mattresses, furniture, etc., all have to be brought to the island by boat, as do replacement parts for anything and everything. Appliances that no longer work can be shipped off island, but that's really expensive. So once something really heavy gets to the island, it's probably not going to leave. So there are these neatly stacked walls between properties that are made of old lobster traps with vines and grasses growing up over them, and old washing machines and refrigerators as their base. There's a tiny school for the youngest students, but once kids finish 6th grade, they have to attend school on the mainland, and they go back and forth only on weekends and only when it's safe to do so. In recent years, creative use of technology has allowed some remote learning. I thought at one time I really wanted to move to Monhegan with my 2 young daughters. I actually applied to be the only teacher in this island's tiny school. But after thinking really hard and long about wintering there with my 2 little daughters, I decided against it. But I have to say that both times I've visited, I have felt a real yearning to know what it would have been like. Monhegan has a lot of colorful history. Wabanaki Indians visited the island centuries before any Europeans, quote unquote, discovered it. They used it as a camp for fishing expeditions, and they caught mostly swordfish, which I don't even know if you can catch in these waters anymore. The explorer Verrazzano saw the island and named it Anne. Captain John Smith of Jamestown fame called it Barty's Island. Samuel de Champlain named it La Nef, or the ship, because he thought that's what it looked like from a distance. The word Monhegan, though, comes from an Algonquian word meaning out to sea island, which is really a logical name. The first Europeans visited really briefly in 1604 and 5 and 12. And there was a British fishing camp there in the early 1600s, mostly for harvesting cod. Monhegan was captured by the French in 1689, and the few buildings on it were burned to the ground. But then it became British again when the French and Indian Wars ended, and it was an island plantation under English colonial control. In 1777, this very energetic cabinet maker named Henry Trevethrin got a deed to the whole island. And with 2 other families, he began the first year-round settlement. Over the next several years, that he and master carpenter Will Stanley built almost all the really old houses that are still there today. I mentioned before the fog signal on Manana Island. Fog is possible every single day of the year. In addition to the fog horn, there's been this lighthouse on Monhegan since 1824. And here it is without fog. It's really a pretty building. In addition to fishing and tourism, Monhegan's residents include many, many artists. There has been an artist colony there since the mid-1800s, and it's attracted many big names. Rockwell Kent spent 5 summers painting on the island, and 3 generations of Wyeths have summered there. I believe that Janie Wyeth still owns this house. It's down a little lane overlooking the ocean. With proper Maine respect for privacy, there is no sign announcing that a famous person lives here. I love the island, but I have to mention one negative. When I first visited Monhegan, the only motor vehicles were 3 trucks. They hauled goods and supplies from the harbor to homes and inns and shops, and they served as emergency vehicles. And walking was the only way for anyone to get around. And the island was just wonderfully quiet and peaceful, even quote unquote downtown in the middle of the village. On my second visit, though, in 2018, there were several noisy golf carts whipping around with evil-smelling exhaust. Not a welcome addition. Apparently, there was a big battle many years ago about one golf cart that a resident needed. She had health problems. And once that was allowed in, they have proliferated. Now visitors can even rent golf carts to zip around the island. And that fact has dramatically, I thought, changed the tone of the whole place. It's understandable that some of the elderly residents might want an easier way to go pick up their groceries or their mail, but I'm really hoping that Monhegan Associates rethinks the rental carts. But even with the blasted golf carts and the seriously increased traffic, it's still a great place to visit. Many people come to this island specifically for walking. As you get off the ferry, you notice so many people with walking canes and walking sticks. There are 17 miles of trails. Narrow woods trails crisscross the ocean, the island from ocean to ocean, or ocean front to ocean front. And thank goodness they're too narrow for golf carts. The cliff trail runs around the island's perimeter, right on the rocky cliffs in many places. And walkers and hikers are warned that many of the trails are narrow and rugged, and they got lots of tree roots and fallen branches and dense undergrowth, and lots of poison ivy. So with all the fog, the trails are also apt to be wet, and that can be particularly dangerous on certain parts of the cliff trail. I wanted to walk around all of it the last time I was there, but I had to leave out a big chunk because so many days were foggy. Visitors are also reminded that the woods and trails aren't truly public. They're owned by the Monhegan Trust, and the Monhegan Trust is delighted to have respectful visitors. That's what they say. Fire, you can see that first thing is no smoking or fires. Fire is a constant worry due to the scarcity of easily accessible water. So smoking isn't allowed anywhere except outdoors and in the village itself, not on the trails. There are no smoking signs even on the isolated hiking paths, just to remind people. Residents have formed a volunteer fire brigade. That old truck there is one of the emergency vehicles. And in many places around the island, there are boxes like this. They have fire axes, other equipment in them. So if anybody coming by is the first person to find a fire, they should open these boxes and do what they can with what's inside. Along with hiking and walking and birding, people travel to Monhegan to draw and paint and make music, which I didn't know on my first trip. Second time I went, I heard the most extraordinary music coming from the little tiny chapel on the island. Complex Baroque music and clearly played by experts. I sort of crept up the steps and peeked in, and I saw 5 musicians: cello, violin, viola, flute, and oboe. And I sat there transfixed for over a half an hour. And later, when I stopped at the tiny pizza place for lunch, I recognized the violinist, and I found out that she brings her instrument to Monhegan every single year to meet up with other musicians and do what she called soak up serenity. I also discovered, by the way, that the violinist is the partner of Brian Pfeiffer, whom many of you know as a long time ago Times Argus reporter, and then a head of Vermont Bird Tours, and the co-author of Birdwatching in Vermont, and a current lecturer at UVM and several other places. And Brian brings me to the other reason why people flock to Monhegan Island, and that is birds. This man is patiently waiting out with a long lens camera a lark sparrow, which is a Western species and should not be at Monhegan Island, but it had been hanging around this location for days and days. My partner, Bernie Paquette, wasn't with me on either of my visits to Monhegan, and he is a much better picture taker than I am. In fact, combined with the frequent fog, kept me from getting many bird photos. I did get photos of gulls, not surprising. I saw and enjoyed 100 species of birds the last time I went, but I got just a few pictures. The ever-present herring gulls, the almost ever-present red-breasted nuthatches, and yellow-rumped warblers. And one distant shot of common eiders, a kind of hefty diving duck that is often found along the North Atlantic coast. Even without photos then, though, I can share memories with you. Spring and fall migration, late May and September, are prime birding times. There can be well over 100 species of birds on the island at any time, resting from long ocean flights, fattening up for the next stage in their journeys. Birders hope for something called a fallout. When migrating birds run into a storm or a strong wind or a front blocking their passage, they fall out of the sky to any available land so that they can wait for better weather. Major fallouts can be stupendous. A few years ago, there was one in Quebec where an estimated 700,000 warblers descended from the skies during one 24-hour period, just covering a little island. I didn't luck into a real fallout. That's luck for birders, by the way, not for birds particularly, on either of my Monhegan adventures, but there were birds everywhere. Oh, I just want to show you first what a fallout looks like. I didn't see one there, but these photos from the web give a hint at what a fallout looks like. This is from a lighthouse at Machias Seal Island, also off the coast of Maine. And there are exhausted little birds everywhere, all over it, almost like, one man said they look like clothespins on a line. But here's my list of birds from September 2001, when I went with Vermont Bird Tours, starting with these, which were seen from the ferry or right in the harbor. And all of these are fairly common species that are seen on the island most of the time. Well, not in the middle of winter, but most of spring, summer, and fall. And these, including on the right, some of the raptors that gather on the island to feast on all the smaller birds. And then finally, look at all the warblers. These little flitting, brightly colored birds are a real treat during either spring or fall migration. That whole half, almost half of the left-hand column and all of the right-hand column are warblers. And these, the species in color, by the way, were rarities even for the island. Yellow-headed blackbirds are a western species, and how a ring-necked pheasant got out there without human help totally boggles my imagination. There's good birding all over the island, starting literally the minute you get off the boat, or the minute you wake up and leave your lodging and start looking into adjacent trees. And sometimes the best birding is in really unlikely spots. This is a sort of unsightly tangle of grapevines, old fencing, and abandoned bits of metal. It was hopping with sparrows, mockingbirds, catbirds, a thrasher, vireos, and warblers, on both of my trips to the island. The inner island trails can be full of thrushes and other birds. The cliff trail and any little ocean cove might reward walkers with ducks and eagles, cormorants, gulls, maybe even the unusual birds called Jaegers. Lobster Cove at the south end of the island is, as you can see, the last resting place of the metal hull of the tugboat D.T. Sheridan, which ran aground in dense fog back in '48. Walking along the shore or sitting on the rocks in this area gives birders good views of common eider and other sea ducks, and shorebirds might be foraging along the small gravel and shell beach. This area, Lobster Cove on the south end of the island, is also one of the only places where the trail doesn't come precipitously down to the ocean. It's a gentle beach here. I will always remember Lobster Cove, not for sea ducks or shipwrecks. And Luann Nielsen and I were just talking about this for Monhegan Island. I remember Lobster Cove for monarch butterflies. My first visit coincided with a huge flight of monarchs, numbering literally in the thousands. There weren't quite as many on my second visit, but they were closer on every aster around me. So what should you know before heading to Monhegan? Well, first, you really should research lodging options, remembering that not every place has electricity, and many don't feature private bathrooms, which a lot of people really want. No matter where you decide to stay, make your reservations well in advance. I'm talking months and months and months. And make your ferry reservations early. And then be sure to call closer to your visit to double check that you're still on the list. If you're staying in a rental cottage, bring pretty much every single thing you're going to need for food or drink. But do plan on one seafood dinner at least in a restaurant, because it is a real main experience. Visitors also have to plan ahead so that they can leave with everything they brought onto the island. Every empty can and bottle, every bit of plastic wrapping, etc. Needless to say, there is no garbage collection. And bring lots of extra clothing. Bring windbreakers, sweaters, rain gear, maybe even long underwear, even if you're going in May or September. Even if you're going in the middle of the summer. Ocean winds can be bitter. And realize that you might very well be out of touch with the mainland at some times during your visit. There are no public telephones, and there's spotty cell phone reception. And definitely pack at least one flashlight. As you can imagine, bringing electricity to an isolated island is a challenge. Many of the buildings that are wired still conserve expensive power by turning it off at night. On my first trip to the island, I stayed in the Monhegan house in the right on this photo. My room was on the 4th floor. Every single bathroom in the place were clustered all together on the 2nd floor. It was quite an adventure groping through pitch dark corridors with my little penlight flashlight when I got up in the middle of the night. Recently, the Monhegan Plantation Power District got a sizable grant from the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Rural Utilities Service and invested in diesel microturbines. And there are also some solar panels now, which are new on the island. So Monhegan has a lot more electricity than it used to have, but energy still is about 5 times as expensive as it is on the mainland. And some of the bed and breakfasts aren't wired at all. And owners and guests enjoy old-fashioned lighting, gas lamps, candles, etc. On my second visit, I stayed in the Island Inn, that behemoth on the harbor in the left-hand picture. There was power all night long, but only the ground floor is heated, and that there's no plan to ever heat the upper floors. So fortunately, there are plenty of blankets. And I loved my little room tucked in under the eaves. It did have a private bath, which was a real luxury. And the inn's extremely famous lobster scrambled eggs in the breakfast buffet are worth having. They're delicious. In fact, both the Island House and the Monhegan House are justifiably proud of their reputation for truly delicious meals. There is one small swimming beach on the island. The water is cold and the tides are strong. And of course, there are no lifeguards, and there are no changing rooms or toilets, etc. No one should ever swim alone there. There are life preservers stashed in several places, but realistically, anyone who falls into the Bay of Fundy's waters doesn't have a big chance of survival. There are public restrooms in only one place, in back of the pizza place, actually, and users are asked to deposit 50 cents per use, as I think it was 50 cents. There's a tiny art and history museum. It's open a few hours a day during the summer. There's a big bulletin board in the middle of the village that has information about events such as art shows or concerts or exhibits. But I think the most popular activity is to just sit and breathe sea air and listen to the gulls and smell brine and relax. Bernie and I had reservations for a week on the island in May 2020, which we had to cancel when COVID-19 hit. We were going to stay in a small efficiency cottage next to Hitchcock House, which I was really looking forward to. And our emails back and forth with a very nice woman, Barbara Hitchcock, made us want to go even more. So we would have cooked most of our own meals. We would have brought everything we need with us. And we're still hoping to do that sometime soon, because this is truly a wonderful place. Let's look at a few more photos of the scenery on beautiful, scenic, and special Monhegan Island. And I like this. It's going to preserve for posterity the wild beauty and biotic communities. The island, by the way, is nothing but a chunk of rock. As you can see, it's very shallow soil, and yet the islanders managed to grow a lot on that very shallow soil with huge amounts of bedrock just a few feet down or a few inches down. And crab is good there. This tree, I believe, is right outside the Island Inn. So I honestly hope that people take a trip to Monhegan and just experience what this tiny community is trying to do to preserve this way of life and the beauty there for ages and ages and ages. And spending money there makes me feel good because I'm contributing to that preservation. So if anyone has any questions or comments, I think we can do it. You have to unmute yourself to give a question. Hi, Annalise, by the way.
Hi, Maeve.
Has anyone else here been on
Yes, I have.
and loved it?
Yeah.
Good, yes.
Yes. Yes.
I've been there twice and fell in love with it.
Oh, me too. I can hardly wait. Maybe this September we'll be able to go back. Maybe, I hope.
Yeah.
Since I've been there in September twice, I'd really like to go in May next time. But
Uh-huh. It'll be cold.
yes, I think so. Any other questions or comments?
You covered it all.
Okay, thank you.
I want to thank you very much. This was wonderful.
You're
I
welcome.
have one. I don't know if you can hear me.
I can, yes.
Are there people with disabilities that live on the island, either physical or mental? I was just thinking about that because I live with cerebral palsy and I use a wheelchair, and you were talking about how they let one woman use a golf cart because she had some leg disability, and
Right.
I was just wondering if you knew of anybody with congenital or acquired disabilities that live there and how they uniquely coped, or whether you saw anything that might tell you how they coped other than the woman in the golf cart.
She was the only, I actually talked to her a while. She's lived there her whole life. And she does have a wheelchair. I believe she uses a wheelchair in her house. I think she lives alone, but I may not be right about that. She is able to get from her wheelchair to the golf cart, but she's also able to get quite around the village part with just the wheelchair. It's not paved, but it's a relatively smooth dirt paths. I don't think she could take them on any of the hiking trails, her wheelchair. I don't know. I don't know. As I get older, I think I would be more and more uncomfortable being there in the winter anyway. But this woman she's hardy, and this is her life. This is her home. But certainly, if you were going to make reservations, you would want to talk to the people who run the place. Oh, I'm not even sure. I don't know how you would get upstairs in some of the lodging places, but I do know that other lodging places are more acceptable. So accessible. So you'd have to talk with them and get clear before going. The ferry would be no problem.
Yeah, and also I was thinking, I use a power wheelchair, so I would need to bring a push wheelchair because of the expensiveness of electricity.
That's true. In fact, they even ask people not to recharge their phones or laptops because of that very, very reason. So that might be a barrier, yes. But again, the best thing to do is to talk to residents there, and they would be able to answer better than I.
Well, thank you for that, because I'm always wondering what people with disabilities are doing in places where I don't live.
Well, on Isla Ho, which is also off the coast of Maine, I think it's much more handicapped accessible and quite gorgeous also. They do allow vehicles, though, which I think is a negative. But nonetheless, that might be something to look into.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, any other questions? Well then, Jane, should I sign off? You're muted. Jane? There you
Sorry.
go.
Thank you, Matt. It was great. And thank you to everybody for coming.
Thank
I
you.
think we can say goodbye.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And your pictures are beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah. Even with a funny little camera that that I don't use very well, but thank you very much. It's so beautiful there that I think a phone or a point and shoot, any would have taken good pictures. Thanks.
Thank you, Mav. It was really good.
Good. Thank you.
Maeve.